Good evening, everyone. Last night, we all got to watch or skip the State of the Union address by President Biden, and it was probably pretty boring, uninteresting, or disappointing. State of a Union address is supposed to highlight the accomplishments of the last year and set forth goals of the next year. Every year, presidents give a painfully scripted speech full of half truths and lies, to be expected, right? They ignore obvious problems and obvious solutions. I'd like to think that every year viewership probably gets lower and lower. This is the Libertarian Party response to the State of the Union, addressing the real state of things. That's what we'd like to do. I'd like to provide a more realistic assessment of our country and maybe propose a better path forward for everyone. I think right now a dark cloud of resentment hangs over the country, and nuclear war looms in our future. And while the resentment and existential threat are both very real, I'd like to cut through that darkness maybe with a message of optimism, which is something that we don't usually hear in a very authentic way. People are waking up to the machinations of the state and rebuking that system. And more people openly express their distrust of government and the pharmaceutical industrial complex. That means more and more people are thinking for themselves. People are turning to their communities for support, to their friends, families, and churches, as it should be. More people are homeschooling. That's incredibly encouraging. School choice is more popular than ever. Cannabis and psilocybin are being decriminalized. People are starting to take real consideration for their mental and physical health. There's a renewed interest in liberty in this country, and people are kind of stumbling forward in the darkness to find it. And as libertarians, it's our job to set an example and to guide people towards free market solutions, to champion free speech, and to explain the concept of peaceful foreign policy. And that mission right now is absolutely critical. President Biden laid out some hefty claims about manufacturing during his speech, but he failed to explain how any of his plan to bring manufacturing jobs back to the United States would actually work. Regulatory policy is not a sexy talking point, but the United States regulatory practices are killing many industries and forcing jobs overseas. And this has been going on for decades. It's why companies outsource. Coupled with heavy taxation, it makes running a large US-based operation nearly impossible for many corporations. High tax rates and heavy regulatory policies drive hundreds of companies like Toyota, Apple, and Medtronic overseas. Running their operations in the United States is not sustainable. They're beholden to shareholders. They have to pay multiple employees. It's not as simple as just planting a flag in the ground and staying here when the government is clearly at war with the people who provide jobs to millions of other people in the country. Strict regulatory policies kill jobs. They are anti-progress and anti-humanity. We need to allow entrepreneurs and businesses the ability to be flexible and to choose their own policies. This also makes way for innovation, and it creates competition in the marketplace, as well as affordable products like prescription drugs. Drug caps by themselves are not a long-term solution to affordable healthcare, and drug caps by themselves do exactly what regulatory policies and other onerous regulations do. They also incentivize businesses to go overseas and look elsewhere for market share. Deregulating, abolishing intellectual property, and relaxing or privatizing licensure are the best ways to make healthcare more affordable for millions of people in this country. Steroid drugs like prednisone cost almost nothing because the patent is expired. Insulin should be the same. There should not be a patent on any prescription drug. Let companies go ahead and fight to keep their trade secrets, but don't give them government protection so that they can keep medicine unaffordable and unattainable. Climate fear-mongering has to go too. We need fossil fuels. We do not have the technology to replace them, and it is incredibly elitist and condescending to sneer in the face of developing countries and tell them they don't deserve to use fossil fuels to lift themselves out of poverty. The same goes for millions of Americans who can't afford luxuries like electric cars. Let's be better than that as a country. We absolutely need to keep fossil fuels, and we need to have the flexibility to choose whatever we want for our energy sources. That goes for consumers as well as corporations. We should not sign on to any international climate pledge that limits the use of fossil fuels or forces us to restrict manufacturing in any way. Corporate environmental, social, and government policies, known as ESG, put unreasonable requirements on organizations to conform to social and political trends that do not serve the best interests of those organizations or consumers. The danger of these policies is that they creep into legislation and regulatory frameworks, crippling entrepreneurs and smaller companies and allowing corporations to work lockstep with government. That is fascism. Corporatism is fascism. Deregulation and the rejection of climate crisis narrative and ESG policies will lead to an increase in the private job sector and a healthy economy. Another thing that Biden touched on was police reform. What we really need in the country is the abolishment of qualified immunity so that police officers will be held accountable for their actions. Until we start getting rid of public unions, that's government employee unions, we are not going to see real progress in this country. It doesn't matter who you elect until you start getting rid of these public unions. They have an absolute stranglehold on many of the policies that take place that are pushed behind the scenes. There's so much to them and they just need to go. Now, by now, we all know, speaking of things that really need to change, we all know the Inflation Reduction Act is a scam. The only way to halt inflation is to stop printing money. We should never dilute the US money supply with more currency. We shouldn't have done it in 2020 with a pandemic. We shouldn't do it now. We shouldn't do it for any circumstance. We need to audit the Federal Reserve and then end it. And in the meantime, I would highly recommend people look into Bitcoin. Nearly 1/10 of our national debt was created over the most recent holiday break. And as Thomas Massey pointed out around the same time, that's more than $200 million from every congressional district in America. That's insane. $1.4 billion in funding for the so-called global multilateral organizations like the UN. That money should not have gone there. A federal building was named for Nancy Pelosi. Got to spend $3.6 million for a Michelle Obama trail. We shouldn't have passed a $1.7 trillion omnibus bill at the beginning of the year, or an $858 billion National Defense Authorization Act. Our national defense can't even spot a balloon. No one can really tell what's going on with the Chinese spy balloon story, but it's definitely embarrassing and represents the United States' failure at diplomacy with one of the world's leading powers. Chinese communist government has a decades-long history of totalitarian abuse, absolutely. But their economic policies have softened recently, and they've started to move towards free market systems. We should try to maintain diplomatic relations with them and encourage them to adopt a policy of free speech. We should probably have also done the same thing with Russia, by the way. We can find communism to be an awful, awful system of governance while still trying to maintain friendly diplomatic relationships with countries abroad. If we can do it for Saudi Arabia, there's no reason we can't do it in other countries where we disagree with how they run things. Maybe like Iran. But anyway, our government's hatred of the Chinese government and its policies come off as kind of hypocritical, right? While we have the largest spying apparatus in the world, the NSA, and all of the dark agencies that surround it, and the largest prison population, that's embarrassing. And we also locked the country down for a virus, which is, President Biden likes to say that we're sort of recovering from COVID. I would remind everyone that the reaction to Emily Oster's pandemic amnesty article was quite visceral. I think that we still have a ways to go in this country before people begin to trust each other. Biden also paid tribute to the high veteran suicide rate. If we want to put a stop to it, we need to bring our troops home. And I encourage everyone to try to pass Defend the Guard legislation in your home states. Lobby your congressperson to make the federal government declare war before sending troops abroad or drone strikes in foreign conflicts. That's the way it should be. These things should happen within the constitutional framework. Right now, they do not. If you care about veterans, if you want to support the troops, what we really need to do is bring them home. And Biden's call to stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes is misguided at best and absolutely malicious at worst. The right thing to do is stay out of foreign conflicts and call for peace talks when it's feasible. The United States meddled in the affairs of Russia and Ukraine in 2014 by helping to stage a coup against their democratically elected leader. The people who live in the Donbass region have been shelled by their own government, and now war has broken out. The conflict is absolutely awful. It's awful that Putin has sent troops into a separatist region and people have died as a result of that. It's awful that Ukrainian soldiers have been conscripted and killed. That's terrible. It's awful to see Ukrainian people suffering. The whole thing is terrible. The United States should pull out of this war because we're engaged in it via proxy, and pull out of NATO too. Not one more penny should go towards this war effort. The suffering should end. The threat of nuclear war should end. Biden bragged about slowing the numbers of illegal immigrants crossing the border, but he's failed to mention how foreign interventionist policies in South and Central America, like the United States' recent meddling in Peruvian elections, have contributed to our border crisis. We need to take a hard look at our foreign policy and failed drug war and see how they've impacted the southern border crisis. It is hubristic and dangerous to avoid accountability. He also talked a lot about fentanyl. Fentanyl is a dangerous drug, and the war on drugs has failed. Both things can be true. Our government should end the war on drugs and reflect on the mental health crisis, the failed public school system full of boredom, bullying, and violence, and the broken homes that have all contributed to rampant drug use in this country, as well as the isolation, despair, and job loss that came from lockdowns and mandates. I think the federal government has a lot of self-reflecting to do on its policies and how those things have impacted mental health across the country. We have a great opportunity to turn these things around if we want to. These are easy fixes. End the drug war. End the federal Department of Education. Return school decisions to the states and to the communities. Stop sending our troops overseas into conflicts in countries where we have no business being. Never institute any sort of vaccine mandate again in the country. Allow people the freedom of association over moral choices. The people of this country have a genuine disagreement over abortion and a lot of cultural issues. Maybe it's best for all parties to declare a ceasefire and just separate. During the past year or so, we've seen states like Texas pass laws outlawing abortion. We've seen California declare itself a sanctuary state for trans kids. And every year, the left-right divide in the United States seems to grow stronger, leaving libertarians in a more and more uncomfortable position. Because we're neither left nor right, but we do believe in the freedom of association. Maybe what's best for the country is a multi-party split. Maybe we just need a trial separation. If we aren't willing to separate more strongly at the state level, we should definitely separate from any global authoritarian organizations like the World Economic Forum. Global organizations like NATO, the UN, and the WEF seek to bind us into entangling alliances. They're dangerous and they should be avoided at all costs. Respect for the individual is what made America such a free and prosperous country. Let's usher in a return to an era of individualism, free markets, and peaceful foreign policy. This is the Libertarian response to the State of the Union. Have a great night, everyone.